This is our Thursday evening study, and we are discussing church history. And this evening, we're going to be talking about the 7th and 8th centuries for the most part. We may go outside those boundaries a little bit, but for the most part, we're talking about the 7th and 8th centuries. And a couple of people that before I talk about the 7th century and the 8th century, there's a couple of other notable people in church history that I probably should have talked about last time, and that are not really in it. It's actually a little bit before the 7th century, but they impacted the church greatly and probably should have been mentioned in my last teaching. There was a man by the name of Isidore of Seville, and he was a scholar, and for over 3 decades he was the Archbishop of Seville, and he's considered a church father, primarily in Spain. He is widely regarded as the last scholar of the ancient world, at a time of disintegration, of classical culture and aristocratic violence and illiteracy. He was involved in the conversion of the Arian Visigothic king to Catholicism, and he was influential in the inner circle of the Visigothic king of Hispania or Spain, along with his brother Leandor and his sister and his parents. They were all involved in converting literally thousands of people to Christianity in the area of Europe that we know as Spain. So he was very important in primarily the 6th century, I guess, the late 6th century and the early 7th century. Isidore lived from 560 to 636. So this is a little bit before the 7th century, but he was very influential in bringing Christianity, solid Christianity, into Spain. Another man is Benedict of Nursia. Now, Benedict I find is a very interesting person. He's a key figure in monastic lifestyle. He's known as the founder of Western monasticism. He left his wealthy, affluent lifestyle to live a life in seclusion as a hermit. But one thing I find interesting about him is that he's also known for being involved in miracles, healing miracles, and as well as prophecies and the ability to get answered prayers. There's even stories that he raised people from the dead. So because of the supernatural nature of this man, he gained a large following, which forced him to leave his life of seclusion, and he was asked to serve as an abbot at a monastery, but was extremely strict, and he wasn't very popular. He wasn't liked at all by the monks the monks that served in his monastery. And actually, there were 2 attempts to poison him. They poisoned his drink on one occasion, but before he drank it, he prayed over his meal, and the glass shattered. That's how the story goes, anyway. Take it or leave it. On another occasion, they poisoned his bread, but God sent a raven to swoop down and steal the bread. So God spared him twice from poison, but that was enough, and he left that monastery and started one of his own, and eventually established 12 monasteries, all in Italy. He's primarily known for what's known as the Rule of Saint Benedict, containing precepts for his monks. A very strict order. After the fall of Rome in 476, it became increasingly difficult for the average person to gain an education. So Benedict was very educated, and he insisted that education be a focus of his monasteries. By the 7th century, virtually nobody had much of an education outside of the monasteries and outside of the priesthood. Many people would actually join the priesthood, or at least join the monasteries, for that purpose. All right, so I want to talk now about Muhammad. Muhammad. No, he was not a Christian, but he did have an impact on Christianity, to really a big impact on Christianity. Muhammad and the Islam invasion into the empire. The Eastern Empire escaped the barbarians that caused the collapse of the Western Empire, and they enjoyed comparative peace. But for 50 years after the fall of the West, the Eastern Empire had to fight for its life. At first, it was kept busy beating off the attacks of the German tribes who tried to cross its border from the north. After this had been done, the Emperor Justinian was even able to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths and North Africa from the Vandals and regain those provinces for the empire in the east. But after another 50 years passed, Emperor Herculius would wage a desperate war with the Persians. In the terrible battle of Nineveh in the year 627, the Persian army was annihilated and the Eastern Empire was saved, but only briefly. And the Islam, the next to come would be Muhammad and the the Muslims. Okay, the inhabitants of Arabia were descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, half-brother of Isaac, and they were heathen, worshiping idols and believing in many gods. In the heathen country of Arabia, there was born in the city of Mecca in the year 570 a boy to whom was given the name Muhammad. Now, Muhammad in his youth was a shepherd and later a merchant. With a caravan of camels, he traveled to various countries. He came in contact with Jews and Christians, and he asked a lot of questions. He seemed to have a desire to learn, and he liked to spend time in isolation in solitary places for meditation. And he claimed to receive visitations and revelations from the angel Gabriel. His teachings were later written in a book called the Quran, which is the sacred book of his followers. Now, his fundamental teaching is there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, the Arabian name for God was Allah. His followers, the followers of Islam, were called Muslims, and the sum of their religion, they sum up their religion by saying Allah is great and Muhammad is his prophet. Now, most of the people who lived in Mecca did not follow Muhammad. They actually rejected his teachings. They did not like his teachings. The opposition actually became so strong that in the year 632, he and his followers had to flee to Medina. Okay, I'm going to have to double check that year. I'm not sure if I've got the right year for that. But this trip from Mecca to Medina took place, and his teachings were much more welcomed in Medina, and that's where he gained a large following. The numbers of followers grew tremendously, and from Medina, he made himself master of Arabia within 10 years. Now, Muhammad was not a good person. He sanctioned violence as a way of converting people, and it has never been, people call it a religion of peace. It has never been a religion of peace. From the very beginning, it was a religion of war. Muhammad had many wives, one of which was only 8 years old. Now, Muhammad died in the year 632, so I have the wrong year as far as when he left Medina. It had to have been much earlier than that. He died in 632, but his influence didn't die with him. He was actually more influential after his death than he ever was during his lifetime. In the next 100 years after his death, his followers became large hosts of fierce horsemen. They swept out of the hot desert of Arabia, conquered Persia, penetrated into India. They overran the imperial province of Asia Minor, twice laid siege unsuccessfully to Constantinople itself. They even took away the Eastern Empire. They took from the Eastern Empire the provinces of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Just as the barbarians had done uh, in Europe and the northern half of the Western Roman Empire, invading wave after wave and gradually conquering. Now for 100 years, Islam was doing the same, but coming from the south, from northern Africa and the southern half of the Roman Empire. Christians in these areas were more withdrawn than the Christians were in Europe. There were there were many monasteries. Christians tended to be more isolated, less militant than Europe, and easily conquered with little real resistance. So the Arabs conquered the Middle East, the Muslims conquered the Middle East and northern Africa, but they did not stop there. They crossed over into Spain, and they destroyed many church buildings and occupied palaces and government buildings in Spain. But the Muslims did not stop in Spain. They crossed into what was once known as Gaul, but now had become the land of the Franks, and eventually became known as France. So they started battling and conquering land there, or at least attempting to. Word of the impending invasion preceded them, prompting a well organized resistance. Now, the emblem of Islam is the crescent, and it's pointed out that the land that they had conquered kind of resembled a crescent. If to the right, to the east, if you take a look at northern Africa, and then to the east, the Middle East, and up to Constantinople, and then in the west they crossed over into Spain and now reaching into France. It seemed to appear in the form of a crescent, and they were trying to make it into a full moon. But so it seemed as if the moon might become full and that all Europe might become Muslim. At the moment of one of the great crises in history, in the history of the church and the world, there arose a hero, and we know him as Charles Martel. He rose to the occasion at the Battle of Tours. Now, on an earlier date in Europe, had been greatly threatened. On an earlier date, Europe had been greatly threatened with terrible danger. This was even before the fall of Rome, when Attila the Hun and the barbaric Huns were defeated in the Battle of Chalons, which was also located in France. Now, once more, almost 300 years later, the whole future of Europe, of the church, and therefore of the world was at stake. Islam seemed ready to engulf and conquer Christianity. The Franks became the champions of Christianity. Recall the conversion of Clovis. Remember, we talked about him, the king of France, back in 496, and the adoption of Christianity by the heathen Franks was an event of utmost importance. Charles, the leader at this time, the leader of the Frankish army, a direct descendant of Clovis by 10 generations, sent out a call for every man in all the Frankish lands able to bear arms and come to his aid. There was a general sense of the greatness of the danger threatening all that men held dear. Even the heathen group, the Frisians, and other non-Christian tribes crossed the Rhine to assist in this battle. Even though it's considered a great Christian army, a Christian battle, there were some non-Christians fighting with them. But it was considered a great Christian army under the command of Charles, and they met to resist, withstand, and push back the countless Muslim hosts on the plain of Tours. And both sides felt tremendous issues would be decided by this one simple battle that was impending. For 7 days, the two armies faced each other, but neither side dared to begin the attack. At last, on a Saturday in October, the battle lines were formed, and the Arab army, was composed mainly of cavalry. The Frankish army was mainly foot soldiers. The Islamic armies held the Islamic armies had behind them one long and unbroken series of victories extending over 100 years. They had conquered village after village, province after province, country after country. They no doubt were very confident. Why would they not likewise win this battle also? The crescent was destined to not become full. The Franks drew up their army in close order. Nowhere was there a gap in their ranks. All day long, in charge after charge, the wild and expert Arab horsemen swept down headlong and furiously upon the Frankish army. Over their heads fluttered the crescent banner, and over the Frankish army was the banner of the cross. Hopelessly, the charges of Arab horsemen broke against the Frankish armies as against a wall. It's like the two sides were butting up against each other as if they were coming against a wall. But you have to understand the Muslims were on horse and had that advantage, whereas the Christians, the Franks and their team, the Christian army, they had no horses. They were on foot. And so they were at a great disadvantage, but yet the Muslims were unable to penetrate their ranks. So the banners of the cross continued to wave defiantly. When night fell, both sides retired, exhausted, to their camps. Heaps of dead covered the bloody fields of Tours. After the most furious attack that Saturday, Arabs were baffled. Franks still brandished their swords. Early the next morning, the Franks again dressed up in their battle array, but no Arab horsemen appeared. Fearing an ambush, the Franks sent out searching parties. For miles around, no enemy was seen. In the deserted Arab camp, they found piles of plunder from many lands. The Arabs had retreated back into Spain. Tours was the high water mark of the Muslim tribe. The once heathen and barbarian tribe of the German Franks had saved Western Europe for Christianity. To Charles, the Frankish commander in the Battle of Tours, was given the title Martel. So he's known as Charles Martel, meaning Charles the Hammer. And he is known in history as Charles Martel or Charles the Hammer. And this is a key point to church history, and the fact that the tide had turned against the Muslims. And the expansion of Islam had stopped at Tours, but they left behind them the wreckage of many churches in many lands. Most of us fail to realize the devastation and bloodshed left behind by the Muslim warriors. Most of us fail to appreciate the significance of this victory and what Charles accomplished. By the conquest of Islam, the Christian church was deprived of many possible mission fields among many heathen nations. In India today, there are many millions of Muslims. Some nations became entirely Muslim. In addition to that, the Arabs had cast up a Muslim barrier across Western Europe to the heathen nations of the Orient. walls which for many centuries remained insurmountable. The church itself had been sadly torn. The provinces of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, which were wrested by the Arabs from the Eastern Empire, had been the seat of numerous and flourishing Christian churches. Spain, too, had been a Christian land. Consider for a moment the long list of casualties. Jerusalem in Palestine had been the cradle of the church. And in Bethlehem, Jerome, the greatest scholar of the church in the West, had given to the church his translation of the Bible into Latin. Antioch in Syria had been the scene of the marvelous eloquence of Chrysostom, the greatest preacher of the ancient church. Alexandria in Egypt had been the home of Clement of Origen and Athanasius. In Carthage and in Hippo in North Africa, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine had taught. In Seville in Spain, Isidore had labored mightily, converting perhaps thousands of barbarians. And now all these areas, it's like the fruit of what they had accomplished is wiped out, and they all became Muslim territory. And there's much more that could be said about this. In fact, I think I want to read, if I can find it, from this book. It's called The Church in History. What I think is a good summary of what was happening. The Spanish Peninsula had again been a Christian land in the broad sense of the word for more than 400 years. It took 800 years to recover that territory. The last Moorish stronghold in Spain was Granada. It was not until the year 1492 that the crescent upon its ramparts was replaced by the cross. The story of the violence done to the church by the Muslims is a black chapter in the church's history. Christ's army in the 7th century suffered its first great defeat, and that defeat was staggering. What were the causes of this inglorious defeat of the church? Civilization had softened the Christian inhabitants of the empire, while wild desert life and had hardened the Muslim Arabs. Monasticism had robbed the empire of thousands who might have been its defenders. Islam promised to men who fell in battle while fighting for the faith special privileges and pleasures in the next world. This inspired the fierce Arab horsemen. They fought with reckless courage and without fear of death. But most important, the salt of Christianity of that day in the eastern part of the empire had largely lost its savor. The Eastern Church had become formalized in its religion and had failed to evangelize those areas into which Islam was now carried its faith. Not only had the internal controversy weakened the church, but Christians expended their energies persecuting other Christians rather than fighting the common enemy. Some persecuted groups were relieved to be conquered by the forces of Islam. Now the church was roughly trodden under the hooves of the Muslim steeds. All right. So let's talk about the Lombards. In the year 568, only 14 years after the Eastern Emperor Justinian regained Italy from the Ostrogoths. The Po Valley in the northern part of Italy was again taken away from the empire. The members of another German tribe had inflicted this new loss. This new tribe, or this new group, is known as the Lombards, which means the Longbeards. I hope you don't mind if I sit. I hope this will work out. All right. So the Longbeards, also known as, well, they are the Lombards, which means the Longbeards. That part of Italy is still known as Lombardy. The rest of the Italian peninsula continued, at least nominally, as part of the empire. Now, there's a thing called the Iron Crown. Now, the Iron Crown is called the Iron Crown because it was believed to have iron nails from the cross in it. Now, did it really have nails from the cross? Probably not. But it was said to have had nails from the cross of Jesus. And so Pope Gregory, eager to show goodwill to the Lombards, gave them the Iron Crown to their king. Now, keep in mind, the Lombards, when they came into Italy, they did consider themselves Christians. They had already been converted from heathenism to the teachings of Arius. Remember, Arius, he was a Christian of sorts. He did not believe in the deity of Christ, apparently, but he was a follower of Jesus. And he would say Jesus is the Son of God, but his view was that Jesus could not be considered God himself. And that was the issue, the debate that took place in the Nicene Creed, the Nicene Council. But Arius did have a large following. There were a lot of Arians that believed as Arius did, including the Lombards. They had been converted to that, although later on they did get converted to Orthodox Christianity and the Nicene Creed. But Pope Gregory I, eager to show goodwill, bestowed the Iron Crown upon the king of the Lombards, and the Franks became even more important to the church. The history of the church, and especially of the papacy, and is now intertwined with the history of the Lombards and the Franks. The presence of the Lombards in Italy was a constant threat to the popes. Emperors in Constantinople were not able to defend the popes. They were not in a position to protect the popes, primarily, I suppose, because of a great distance between Constantinople and Rome. But plus, there had been considerable friction that had developed between the emperors and the popes. So the popes, when they were hard pressed by the Lombards in their hour of danger, they turned to the Franks for help. So it was the Lombards who drove the popes into the protective arms of the Franks. And the next key person among the Franks is a man by the name of Pepin. He's known as Pepin the Short. And he is actually he is a direct descendant of Clovis, but he's the son of Charles Martel. Clovis had been a very strong, influential leader, but the later Frankish kings in his line were quite weak, and most of them were king in name only, while the actual ruling was done by an outstanding officer, a leader of the army. Charles Martel, the hero of the Battle of Tours, was not king of the Franks, but he was the highest office holder under one of those weak kings. And in reality, he had the power of a king, but his son, Pepin, obtained the same high office that Charles had, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted to be king, so he deposed the feeble, weak King Childeric, putting him in a monastery and putting himself on the throne as king of the Franks. But he felt like this act needed to have the sanction and approval of the Pope. So Pope Zacharias at that time readily gave his approval, saying that It's only right that if someone's going to have the power of a king, that they should also have that title. So in the year 751, Pepin the Short was anointed and crowned king of the Franks. And it was an event of far-reaching consequences. What had taken place might not have seemed like that big of a deal at the time. It may have seemed like something very simple, but in a way, it was the most important event of medieval church history. From it, from that single event, many popes and other leaders felt like the church or the popes had the power to install kings and take away kings and uphold kingdoms or tear down kingdoms. It gave them the impression that they had really more authority than what they really did, but they moved upon that authority, taking advantage of weak political rulers throughout the Middle Ages. But it was the first step towards the reestablishment of the empire in the West, and out of that grew a tremendous struggle between the papacy and the empire, which was to make up a large part of the Middle Ages. So one good turn deserves another, so reasoned Pope Zacharias. So Zacharias asked Pepin that he in turn render him a service, helping him against the Lombards, who continued as a constant threat to his power and safety. And there were, it's really crazy. These were Christians fighting against Christians. The Lombards considered themselves Christians. The popes, of course, considered themselves Christians. The church, it was known as the Catholic Church, Catholic with a small c, the Universal Church. The Franks considered themselves Christians. All these Christians fighting against each other, and I would say they were so-called Christians fighting against so-called Christians. It's really a scar on church history, the way Christians were behaving at that point. Pepin marched with his army into Italy. The Franks fought and defeated the Lombards and compelled them to surrender part of their territory to the Pope, and it began what's known as the state of the church, or the papal states of the church. The Pope now held not only ecclesiastical power, but also became a temporal ruler, and he also would have a standing army. The popes continued to hold temporal power until 1870, when the new Kingdom of Italy was established, and the state of the church was, and the states of the church were made part of it. Okay. Pepin had two sons, and upon two sons that I'm aware of. There may have been more, but two that are important to this story, to church history. Upon his death, Pepin the Short, in the year 768, he had his two sons, Carolman and Charles, succeed him, and they share the power of being dual king of the Franks. But Carloman died in 771, so Charles ruled alone, and that's when his real reign began. Charles is now king of the Franks, but he soon becomes emperor. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charles was kneeling in St. Peter's Church in Rome, and the Pope strode by and placed upon him the imperial crown. By that act, the Pope made Charles emperor. And it appeared entirely appropriate that Charles should be made the emperor, because he stood for the same three things that the Pope stood for. Those three things are law and order, civilization or culture, and Christianity. And Charlemagne accomplished much. He became probably one of the greatest rulers of that era, of the early Middle Ages. And he fought for these three things, the three things I just mentioned: law and order, civilization or culture, and Christianity. He established secure, uh, security and order by making wise laws and by seeing to it that the laws were enforced. He fostered civilization and learning by promoting education, promoting schools throughout his wide domain. The barbarians, as conquerors of the civilized Romans, looked down with proud disdain upon learning and culture as being something effeminate, but not Charlemagne. He was not an educated man, but he established a school. He called it the Palace School. He established a school and became a pupil of his own school, and he established it in his own residence. He tried to learn, he tried to read and write. It is said that his mighty fist and his fingers never could handle a pen. He he was engaged in war nearly all his life. He first fought the Lombards. He made an end of their kingdom in the year 777 and set the iron crown of Lombardy on his own head. Next, he fought diligently at the work of liberating Spain from the Muslim Arabs. And there was also war with the Saxons. Through the greater part of his reign, Charlemagne also carried on a war with the Saxons. They were a large and powerful Germanic tribe who occupied the northern part of Germany. The Saxons were fierce, untamed, heathen warriors, and it was only after many hard campaigns that Charlemagne was able to subdue them. He had their territory. He added their territory to his domain and forced them at the point of a sword to accept Christianity. Can you imagine that? Forced them at the point of a sword to accept Christianity. So at this point, there were three great empires. In this part, as I'm talking about the 7th and the 8th century, as the 8th century comes to a close and we begin entering into the 9th century, the early part of the 9th century, there's three great empires when Charlemagne died in the year 814. There were three great powers or empires in the world. The oldest, but also the weakest, was the Eastern Empire. It embraced the Balkans, the Asia Minor, and southern Italy. The largest of these three empires was the Muslim Arabs. It stretched from the borders of India in the east through Persia and Syria and Palestine in Asia and all of northern Africa and a small part of Europe. The youngest and the strongest of these three was the empire of Charlemagne, and it began to be known as the Holy Roman Empire. And it at his death consisted of the northern half of Italy, the eastern corner of Spain, all of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and a large part of Germany and Austria. The realm of Charlemagne was truly imperial in size. Since the fall of Rome, no such extensive territory had been under one government in Western Europe. Charlemagne was easily the greatest ruler between Justinian and Charles V. He towered above the Middle Ages and cast his shadows over the medieval centuries. Charlemagne's favorite reading was The City of God by Augustine. He loved to think of his empire as the kingdom of God on earth. The Arab empire of the Muslims, the Arab empire was Muslim. The Eastern empire was Christian, but comparatively small and weak. Of the three empires, that of Charlemagne certainly held the best and brightest promises for the future of the church and of mankind. Now, Pepin, by giving some of his lands to the Lombards, or some of the land of the Lombards to the Pope, laid the laid the foundation for the states of the church, or the papal states. He made the Pope a temporal ruler. Charlemagne freed the popes forever from the fear of the Lombards, brought order out of the chaotic conditions of the time, began the expulsion of the Muslims from Western Europe, brought the heathen Saxons within the pale of Christendom, and brought learning and culture. The Pope, by crowning Charlemagne emperor, restored the empire of the West, and by doing that, he set the stage for the gigantic and momentous struggle between the empire and the papacy. The alliance which the church made with the Franks had borne abundant fruit. And that's it for today. God bless you. We will continue next week as we go deeper into the Middle Ages and the